Welcome back to TK Tennis. Can these two strokes be both classified as next-gen forehands? And if so, should they be? Because these are two fundamental different approaches in preparing to hit a tennis ball. And are both Carlos Alcaraz and Jannik Sinner both hitting the next-gen forehand? That's what we're going to find out in today's video. So let's start here. If you believe these two strokes can both be classified as next-gen forehands, then tennis has a classification problem. This video is essentially a follow-up to my previous video where I stated the aggressive next-gen forehand was a scam and was garbage. If you haven't seen that previous video, check it out after this one. Now, I did make some mistakes in that previous video, or did I? And maybe I wasn't clear enough. Certainly the chart I showed was incomplete, and thanks to those of you who pointed out those issues, so I'll clear that up as well. Additionally, I'm not suggesting I'm an authority on how we categorize strokes. I'm just suggesting there is a problem. And certainly there is when we're using these vague, broad, time-based terms such as next gen or modern forehand. That's all relative and it changes with generation. And thanks to FS Silver 330 for sharing this comment where he said, Jack Kramer published an article titled The Modern Forehand back in 1960 or 62. From this article, he learned that the modern forehand is a flat shot with shake hand grips and a firm wrist. So just think about that. These modern forehand and next-gen labels make absolutely no sense. So let's start with Musetti here. In the last video where I claimed the next-gen forehand was a scam or was garbage, I was primarily referring to, or strictly referring to, this particular forehand used by Musetti, Nick Kyrgios, Thomas Mahak, Andy Roddick in the past, or anyone who has a high elbow-up position and faces their racket head forward. This is not the pure definition of a next-gen forehand. Just because you have your elbow up and your racket facing forward does not classify it as the next-gen forehand. But for the sake of that other video, I was railing against this particular forehand, which going forward, I'll call the Gull Wing forehand because I think it needs to be defined because this is a completely different approach. And I stand by my assessment that this is garbage and it's a scam, and that if you're a junior or a recreational adult, you should not be approaching how to hit a tennis ball in your preparation phase with this sort of technique. So you may have noticed in my previous chart where I listed Jannik Sinner as not having a next-gen forehand, and that was wrong, or was it? So let's take these two examples. Novak Djokovic, which is known to have a classic modern forehand, and Jannik Sinner, which is known to have a next-gen forehand. But as you can see here in this stage, they're pretty much identical. Both of them have their elbows low, and both are facing their rackets more upwards than forward. So at this stage, it's essentially the same. So let's roll forward with Jannik Sinner. Boom. Here's the difference. Did you see that? Watch Jannik Sinner's racket face. And this is what most people would define Jannik Sinner as the next-gen forehand, right? The hitting side of the racket is now facing back towards the fence. By most people's definition, this would be the classic case of the next-gen forehand, right? Well, let's find out. Let's watch Yanic roll out his hitting side of his racket face towards the ball. As he moves forward, you'll see the wrist supination change, and the hitting face now goes towards the ball. Supposedly, that's what makes a next-gen forehand a next-gen forehand. Or does it? Now let's take a look at Novak Djokovic and pay close attention to his hitting side of his racket face as I move this forward. And most people would define a modern forehand as the racket face will continue pointing to the side of the court or down and not towards the back. So let's take a look. Wait a minute. That's not supposed to happen. Look at Novak and how he's facing the hitting side of his racket is also facing to the back of the court. Well, that's new. Or is it? But we all know Novak has a modern forehand. So what happened? Well, he changed it. He hasn't always hit the ball like this. So let's take a look at the man himself, Roger Federer. The classic modern forehand. Elbows down, racket face is facing up, not forward. Now let's roll it and let's see where his racket face points to. Will it point down or will it point out towards us? Because we know it certainly won't face the back of the court, right? So as we move it forward, Look where his racket face is pointing, sort of down and out. Now pointing down to the ground with the classic wrist lag, and the face points towards the ball. But at no time did his racket face point towards the back of the fence. But if he wanted it to, and he wanted to supinate his wrist to turn it into a next-gen forehand, he certainly could have, right? So let's come back to Novak. Something is not adding up. If you can start out in a classic position, not in the gull wing position, but with your elbow down and your racket face pointed up, and this is part of what defines a classic modern forehand. But now, as you roll it forward, if you want to change from a modern forehand to a next-gen forehand, are you telling me all you need to do is supinate your wrist? Okay, maybe that's true. But does that define a new classification of stroke? Just because you supinate your wrist and you face the racket face towards the back of the fence, are we claiming that's an entirely new stroke? Versus what I showed you before with the gull wing forehand, which is clearly a very different approach to preparing for the ball. And that's my point, and where I think there's a problem in these classifications of strokes. But let's take Carlos as another example. What is he actually hitting? Most people would say it's a next-gen forehand. Well, let's find out. At this point, he's very much in the same position that Novak and Yanic were. The elbow is down and the racket face is pointing upwards. So it's clearly not a gull wing forehand. So the gull wing next-gen forehand, he's clearly not executing. Or is he? Let's roll it forward. Now his elbow did rise a little bit, and his racket face is facing a little bit more forward, but not dramatically. Let's roll it forward and see where his racket face is facing. Is this a modern forehand or a next-gen forehand? Let's roll it. Wait a minute. His racket face is pointing to the ground and towards us. At no point did I see it facing towards the back of the court. But most people would say Carlos has a next-gen forehand. Where do you see it? I certainly didn't. This seems more like a modern forehand with a slightly higher elbow position, closer to gull wing, but it certainly is not. And this seems to me like a modern forehand. And that's the point of this video. There's a problem with the classification of these strokes, and they don't seem to make any sense. So I'm going to try and clear it up. Again, I'm not the authority on stroke classification, but I think we need to do better. So let's come back to the chart I showed in the very first video. This chart right here, forehands of the top ATP players. This was certainly incomplete, and I shouldn't have had it on the video. My intention was to actually show some more people with a modern forehand evolution. Clearly, this chart was incomplete and not satisfactory to most people. So instead, I have a new updated chart. My contention is just because you face the racket head towards the back of the court, should that designate as a new type of forehand? I don't think that makes any sense. And this chart reflects that. I believe this should be an add-on. So in this first column right here, I have the next-gen forehand with a gull wing, and that's these individuals. And the gull wing, of course, is when you're facing your racket face forward and your elbow is up high. That's an entirely different approach to hitting a tennis ball. However, now you have the modern forehand section, where you have the traditional modern forehand where the racket face does not face the back of the court. So in the past, that would have included Novak. But today, it would include Medvedev, Ruud, Rublev, Dimitrov, Fritz, Tsitsipas, Shelton, and many of these other players that are still utilizing the modern forehand and don't face their racket face towards the back of the court. And my contention is there should be a new category, or maybe not a new category, but it's a modern forehand with next-gen supination. And it's basically an add-on. It's not an entirely new stroke. The supination add-on, when you face your racket face back to the back of the court, you can do that with a next-gen forehand, which essentially has it built in, and then you could also add it to a modern forehand. And examples of these players would be Jannik Sinner, who I have spelled incorrectly. Apologies there, because people think I'm a linguistics expert and a spelling expert. I am not, so I will make some mistakes. And of course, now it includes Novak, because he's facing the racket face towards the back of the court. And Alcaraz. Well, wait a minute. But this is not correct. I just showed you on the previous slow motion that Alcaraz actually doesn't face his racket face towards the back of the court and doesn't have that type of wrist supination. So instead, he should actually be in this category. And then you also have Rafa. And if you look at his forehand closely, he also turns his racket face towards the back of the court. So does he have a modern forehand or a modern forehand with the NextGen Supination add-on? Now, I may be wrong, and maybe I'm thinking about this the wrong way, but this to me makes more sense, that the modern forehand with the next generation supination is an add-on and should not define a stroke as a whole. My point of this video was not necessarily to be an authority on this subject matter, but it's to challenge conventional wisdom. Or in this case, I don't think it's conventional wisdom. I think it's conventional knowledge. And we should have a discussion about this. And if you disagree, that's okay. Just be mature about it in the comments, and let's have a discussion and a constructive dialogue, because clearly the definition of these strokes is unclear and confusing to a lot of individuals, including myself, who's been playing and teaching the sport. So I think there's one final question that many recreational players would have. Should I hit a modern forehand with the wrist supination add-on like Carlos Alcaraz and Jannik Sinner? And I think it's pretty simple. I don't think you need to make that decision when you're practicing your game, because if it's an add-on, what you could be doing is focusing on having your elbow in the proper position and preparing properly with your unit turn, like both Yanic and Carlos are here. What I certainly think you should avoid is the Gull Wing forehand approach. That's where I believe you will be misguided, and it's the wrong way to approach a ball. But if you can take the core fundamentals of hitting a modern forehand, and then if you want to experiment with adding in the wrist supination to make it a next-gen style modern forehand, or a modern forehand that's evolved, that's probably the better path to take. I don't think you have to decide that I'm going to hit a next-gen forehand with this extreme wrist supination, because it's not that easy to pull off, and it takes commitment to face your racket head towards the back of the court and have this extreme wrist supination. And ultimately, for a recreational player, it adds more complexity, which also then, therefore, most likely adds more inconsistency, unless you're able to commit to practicing that wrist supination. So those are my thoughts for today's video. In the very next video, I'm going to share the pro players that I think that you should copy, that have a little bit more simplistic approach to the modern forehand than Carlos or Yanic do here. So stay tuned to the next video, where I'll show you what I believe are my favorite players to mimic in terms of simplicity and execution, and to be consistent playing tennis. And I know it's annoying to ask, but if you like these videos, please subscribe and like. And if you have any questions or constructive thoughts, please leave them in the comments, and I will see you in the next days.